Selamat siang, Ibu Nia. Mohon izin konfirmasi, apakah ini Ibu Endah Trikurniawati dari BPDLH? Halo, halo Ibu Nia.
Ya, selamat siang.
Halo, selamat datang Ibu.
Ya,
Baik, ya.
dengar
eh,
suaranya Mbak.
Terima kasih sudah hadir Ibu. Sebentar lagi kita akan langsung mulai ya Bu ya.
Siap. Oh.
Baik, terima kasih Bu.
Katagonia's Guide for Zoom Users. Panduan Katagonia untuk pengguna Zoom. Saat ini, host atau admin sudah mengaktifkan fitur interpretation. Bapak Ibu dipersilahkan untuk menggunakan Zoom versi terbaru agar fitur interpretation dapat bekerja dengan baik. The host has activated the interpretation feature. Ladies and gentlemen, you are expected to use Zoom. Please install the latest version for the interpretation feature work well. Please go to www.zoom.us/download. Mohon Bapak Ibu menonaktifkan mic atau mengklik tombol mute apabila tidak sedang berbicara. To help today's meeting run smoothly, please mute when you are not speaking. Jika Bapak Ibu ingin mendengarkan terjemahan dalam bahasa Indonesia, klik Interpretation, pilih Indonesian. Anda tidak perlu pindah channel saat berbicara. Jangan khawatir, pembicara dan interpreter dapat mendengar Anda. If you'd like to listen in English, click Interpretation, then choose English. You don't need to change channel when speaking. Don't worry, the resource person and the interpreter will be able to hear your voice. Untuk pengguna Zoom Mobile, klik More untuk masuk ke pilihan berikutnya. Pilih Language Interpretation. Lalu pilih Indonesian untuk bahasa Indonesia. For Zoom mobile users, click More to go to the next choice. Then, choose Language Interpretation. Then, choose English for English. Mohon dipastikan bahwa Bapak Ibu sudah memilih salah satu bahasa yang akan digunakan. Karena jika Bapak dan Ibu tidak memilih, suara Bapak dan Ibu akan mengganggu pembicara dan proses penerjemahan. Terima kasih atas perhatian dan kerjasamanya. Please make sure that you have selected the correct language for not making any noises for both speakers and interpreters. Thank you for your attention and cooperation. Jika ada kendala mengenai fitur ini, silakan hubungi host yang sedang bertugas atau hubungi IT support. If you have any technical problems regarding this feature, feel free to chat the host on duty. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ministry of Finance Learning Week Day 4 is about to begin. But before that, let me take a moment to review a few technical details. Today's webinar will be conducted in English. However, it comes with English-Indonesian simultaneous interpretation. To listen to the translation, click the globe icon or three dots icon. Select interpretation and choose English-Indonesian accordingly. It is advised that you do not click the mute audio, but should you wish to do so to obtain a clearer audio rendition, please make sure to manually switch off the interpretation when someone on the floor is speaking in the language that you are listening to. This webinar is also available on our YouTube channel. That's all the information. Let us now begin the Ministry of Finance Learning Week Day 4, Economics of Net Zero Emissions, Navigating Climate Change, Systemic Risk, and Opportunity. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back to Learning Week Day 4, Economics of Net Zero Emissions, Navigating Climate Change, Systemic Risk, and Opportunities. First of all, I would like to thank God the Almighty that has given us blessings to virtually attend this webinar. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the Head of Financial Education and Training Agency, Bapak Andin Hadianto, the Secretary of Financial Education and Training Agency, Bapak Bambang Juli Istanto, the Director of Fund Collection and Development, Indonesian Environment Fund, Ibu Endah Tri Kurniawati, our special guest speaker, Professor Sam Venghauser, and our moderator, Bapak Irwan Darmawan. My name is Pradina Anis, and I am honored to be the master of ceremony of this event. Today is the last day of Ministry of Finance Learning Week 2024. On behalf of the organizing committee, we extend our appreciation for each and every one of you. We are very grateful for the enthusiasm of the participants ever since day one of Ministry of Finance Learning Week 2024. Best regards to all participants who have joined us today, and I am very pleased to announce that we have 100 participants who are joining this event via Zoom and YouTube at the moment. Dear participants, to officially open this webinar, we are pleased to listen to the opening remarks by the Director of Fund Collection and Development, Indonesian Environment Fund, Ibu Endah Tri Kurniawati. Ibu Nia, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mbak MC, and then very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, Bapak Andin, and then resource persons, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon again, and thank you for this opportunity. First of all, we would like to apologize because Pak Joko has a high-level meeting with the minister, so that's why Pak Joko asked me to represent him. And then at this opportunity, we would like to read his speech. First of all, we would like to thank you for this great honor to be here today to discuss a matter that is not just critical to our economy, but to the very survival of our planet, the economics of net zero emission. As we navigate the complexities of the climate change, we must recognize the systemic risks it poses and incredible opportunities that lie ahead. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, climate change is no longer a distant threat, it is a current reality. The latest scientific reports warn us that if we don't act decisively, the consequences will be catastrophic, from extreme weather events to rising sea levels. The impact are profound and far-reaching. The question we face is not whether to act, but how to act effectively and efficiently. Our NDC reflects this commitment. We aim to reduce greenhouse gases emission by 31.89% by 2030, but the potential to reach up to 43.2% with the international support. This target seems quite ambitious, but they are grounded in our understanding of the challenges we face and the opportunities that lie ahead. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in order to support this commitment on net zero emission and climate change and fulfilling the gap of financing, the government of Indonesia has established the Indonesian Irman Fund in 2019, and or we call it as IF, and IF officially under the Ministry of Finance and directed by technical line ministries, to guide and oversee the running of IF, which include the coordinating ministries and technical ministries. IF is mandated to mobilize environmental finance from multi-sources, from international and national level, to be delivered to multi-purpose through multi-financial instrument in addressing the environmental problem. Since its establishment, IF has been managing around 1.6 billion US dollar. Most of them are coming from international partner using grant scheme, and majorly focused on forestry sector right now for the initial fund. And the rest is intended for renewable energy sector. And IF is also managing fund from state budget, is mandated from the Ministry of Finance, Minister of Finance, such as revolving fund from reforestation fund and also waste management, as well as endowment fund for disaster pooling fund. The existing international partner coming from bilateral partners such as Kingdom of Norway, philanthropists, and multilateral funds such as Green Climate Fund, the World Bank, and also global environmental facilities. IF continuously extend its mandate and develop innovative financing or blended finance to support the government of Indonesia in order to scale up climate finance, which might contribute to NDC implementation in order to achieve the net zero emission. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as we move forward, let us remember that our fight against climate change is not just about meeting targets. It is about creating the sustainable future of 4 generations to come, and Indonesia stands firm in its commitment to achieving net zero emission and fulfilling our NDC. At this moment, in Kemenkeu Learning Week, this is great media or forum to learning about sustainability financing in several areas, including climate change and also environmental as a whole. We sharing and transfer knowledge about strategy and how to mitigate its risks. Let us commit to bold action, to innovate thinking, and also to collaborate efforts. Together, we can navigate the complexity of climate change, mitigate systemic risks, and also unlock opportunities for prosperous and sustainable future. So I think that's all from Pak Joko's speech, and we do hope this forum can result a fruitful benefit to all of us. Thank you. Good afternoon. Back to Mbak MC.
Thank you, Ibu Nia, for the opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's the time for the main event that we have been waiting for. But before that, let me introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Bapak Irwan Darmawan. Bapak Irwan is a senior policy analyst and team leader for fiscal policy for climate change in Fiscal Policy Agency, Ministry of Finance since 2021. For almost a decade, Bapak Irwan is actively involved making climate change financing policy in Indonesia. Without further ado, Bapak Irwan Darmawan, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Pradina, for your great introduction. It is an honor for me to be here, and I would like to welcome our honorable guests and audience who have joined us today, either in this Zoom meeting or through our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Before we start, I would like to make a housekeeping announcement to our audience. Ladies and gentlemen, our honorable guests, if you don't mind, please keep your camera on and your microphone muted throughout the entire talk. The talk will go on for about 45 minutes, followed by 20 minutes for a Q&A session. Please free to ask your questions, and there are several ways to do that. If you are joining from Zoom, either write down your questions into the Zoom chat feature to which I will read them, or click on the raise hand button and I will call your name when it's time and you can unmute yourself then ask your question. If you are joining us through live streaming on YouTube, please write down your questions into the live chat feature and I will read them. Again, you can either write your questions in the Zoom or YouTube chat box or by the raise hand feature on the Zoom. Okay, now allow me to introduce our speaker, Professor Sam Fanghauser, who will deliver his talk about economics of net zero emissions, navigating climate change, systemic risks, and opportunities. Professor Sam Fanghauser is a professor of climate economics and policy at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford and research director of Oxford Net Zero. Before moving to Oxford, Sam was director for the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics, where he remains a visiting professor. He has also worked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank, and the Global Environment Facility. He was an inaugural member of UK Climate Change Committee and a non-executive director of CDC Group, now British International Investment, the UK's development finance institution. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Sam Fanghauser. Good morning,
Hello.
Sam. How are you? It is nice to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for the very kind introduction and the amazing sort of introductory remarks. You set up the scene very well, and it's great to be with you remotely, but to be with you nonetheless. I understand this is day 4 of a very intensive week that you've already had. So hopefully we can continue the sort of the level of engagement and discussion and interaction that we have had.
Okay.
Let me share my screen just to get straight into things, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
So good. So as we've heard, I'm going to talk about the economics of net zero emissions. So that's one half of the greenhouse gas or the climate change problem, and the other half, of course, being the need to adapt to climate risks. But I'm talking about reducing emissions today, so dealing with the causes of climate change rather than dealing with its consequences. But just to motivate while we're doing that, something we've also heard in the introductory remark, climate change is a current reality. We can see the first signs of climate change. That's sort of a statement that most people sort of would concur with, but we have to sort of give the evidence for it because there's a certain amount of rhetoric involved in it as well. On this slide, I'm giving you 2 pieces of evidence. On the left-hand side is a story of average temperature or climate, global mean temperatures over the last 100 years or so. It's probably quite small for you to read, but on the x-axis, you have sort of years from about 100 years ago to today. On the y-axis, each one of those rows is a particular country, a particular geography. And each one of the cells that you see, the color in that cell shows you whether temperatures have been above or below the average over those 100 years. Blue means below average, red means above average. And just visually, you can see it's getting warmer. You can see all the orange and red years, the hot years, they're all in the present. the colder years, they're all in the past. So climate, as in average weather, the sort of the typical weather that we have, clearly, unambiguously, is getting warmer. We can also see that, and that's the bit on the right-hand side of your chart. We can also see those trends in individual specific extreme events. It used to be very difficult to sort of say that a particular drought or a particular typhoon was caused by climate change. It was just because weather is so variable. It was difficult to distinguish what was a normal variation and what was a signal. But we now have the computing power to calculate the probabilities. And just to give you an example, a recent typhoon in your neighborhood, Typhoon Gami, apparently has two named that storm. It's also called Karina, which occurred over the summer this year. We can statistically say an event of that type, the rainfall levels that were experienced were about 9 to 14% higher. And the total rainfall was 60% higher because of man-made climate change. So that storm would have happened anyway. We're not making statements about the frequency of extreme events, but we're making statements about the intensity of them. And that storm was clearly sort of significantly more intensive than it would otherwise have been. So the climate is changing. It is, as we heard in the introductory remark, a current reality. So what do we do about it? Three things I'm going to talk about. I'm first going to remind people about the meaning of that phrase, net zero emissions, that we all use when we talk about climate change and our targets. We often talk about reaching net zero emissions. I'm going to explain to people or remind those of you who already know what the meaning of that phrase net zero emissions is. We're then going to look at how one reduces greenhouse gas emissions, progress in doing so, and strategies of doing so. And we then look at some of the risks, the economic risks, the social risks, but also the opportunities that arise from this transition to net zero. So that's the plan. Let's start with the meaning of net zero. And for a lot of people, net zero sort of arose arrived in their lives with the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement on climate change is sort of 9 years old by now. It was signed in 2015 at the sort of regular UN climate summit in Paris at the time. And pretty much every country on the planet has signed up to the Paris Agreement. A key feature of the Paris Agreement is that it sort of gives us a societal goal as to how much climate change we feel would be societally acceptable. And the conclusion reached in Paris, the consensus was that we should keep climate change at well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial times, ideally as close as 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to remember we're talking about climate. We're not talking about weather. Weather fluctuations, between summer and winter, between day and night are a lot more than 1.5 to 2 degrees. But climate fluctuations, sort of average trends in the climate, 1.5 to 2 degrees is actually a lot. Human beings as a species, Homo sapiens, have only ever existed in a climate band that is sort of plus minus about 1 degree, 1.5 degrees perhaps. So what we're sort of saying with the Paris Agreement is we're probably gently going beyond our experience as a species and the sort of climates we have had over the last 10,000, probably much longer years. So that's what people, negotiators in Paris agreed, a societal target. We can then pass on that societal consensus to the climate scientists and ask what sort of amount of greenhouse gas emissions is consistent with that 1.5 to 2 degree target. Climate science is something very complicated, but a lot of the complicated factors cancel each other out, and it gives you a very simple rule of thumb. The global increase in temperature that we observe is directly proportional to the cumulative emissions, the sum total of emissions over time that we put into the atmosphere. So for each temperature level, there's a carbon budget associated with that amount of temperature. And scientists can calculate if our objective is 1.5 to 2 degrees, scientists can calculate roughly what the carbon budget is that is associated with that target. And the answer is it's about 250 billion tons of carbon left. So scientists tell you this is the budget, and the carbon budget's a bit like a financial budget. You then have to figure out how quickly you spend the money. And the chart or the carbon in this case, the chart you look at here sort of exemplifies that. You have different emissions paths. The black line shows you how emissions have been historically. The blue and red lines show you different strategies of reducing emissions. If we continue at business as usual, we will use up that 250 billion tons carbon space very, very quickly, and emissions will have to come down very rapidly indeed. Alternatively, we can start reduce emissions now, and that gives you still a steep, but a smoother, softer, gentler trajectory of using up the remaining carbon space, the remaining 250 billion tons. How we do that? That's a societal choice again. Science tells us how much carbon we have left. Society decides how we want to use it up. But obviously that societal choice is informed again by science. It's informed by engineering, economics, behavioral science. It's informed by knowledge about technological progress. It's knowledge about the cost of technologies, how those technologies might progress, behavioral attitudes, and so on. And if you put those features into a global climate economy model, we can calculate what a sort of an efficient or rational or meaningful way would be to use up the 250 billion tons that we have left. And what you then get out of those climate economy models is a path a little bit like the one you're looking at here. There's a plume here because obviously there are different ways of doing it. There's a range. But broadly speaking, what a rational emissions path would look like is we halve our global carbon emissions by 2030, so within less than 10 years. And you then continue reducing emissions, and by roughly the middle of the century, we have used up the carbon space. We have used up the 250 billion tons that are associated with 1.5 degrees of global warming. What happens once we have used up our carbon space? That's when this notion of net zero becomes meaningful. What happens at that point is that we need to have a balance of emissions into the atmosphere and man-made removal of carbon from the atmosphere. That's the meaning of net zero, this net zero balance of carbon in and out of the atmosphere. So there will be residual emissions. That's sort of part of net zero. We don't go to gross net zero. There will be some emissions left. But those emissions have to be removed, and they have to be removed either back into the lithosphere, the Earth's crust. So that's greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide removal through sort of geological means. Or the carbon gets removed and put into the biosphere. That's things like reforestation and tree planting and so on. So we will, by the middle of the century, when we've used up our carbon space, we will have to find this balance between whatever emissions we have left and their removal into either the lithosphere or the biosphere. Now, the thing we shouldn't do is doing too much net and not enough zero. What I mean by that is that there's a limit to the amount of carbon we can remove out of the atmosphere. It's expensive, and there's sort of biophysical limits to it. So reducing emissions is still the primary target of net zero. So bringing emissions down as close to zero as possible is what we have to do. And then the residual, which hopefully is very small, can be removed. So that's the sort of the meaning of net zero in a nutshell. We can come back to the sort of implications of that, if you will, in the Q&A. Let's move on though to second thing I want to talk about with you this afternoon, which is progress in reducing emissions. How have we done in bringing emissions down, and what can we do to bring them down even further? The first thing I want to say is that Indonesia, we just heard what the target for the country is for 2030. Indonesia is not alone. Most countries in the world, covering about 90% of GDP and 80% of emissions and people, most emissions in the world are subject to a net zero pledge. So the countries or the firms or the cities that are responsible for those emissions have pledged to bring them down to net zero, defined in a way we've just seen as a balance between residual emissions and removal of emissions. So net zero is the new normal. Everybody is committed to it. The question is, do these commitments have sort of practical environmental meaning, or are they just empty pledges? That's kind of what the challenge is. The pledges are there. Can we implement them in a sort of efficient and rational way? That's the question. And to answer it, the starting point is to look where the emissions come from. And I look at emissions here by country. It's quite an ingenious chart that I've stolen from somebody else. You see on the x-axis here population, and you see on the y-axis emissions per person. So if you multiply those two numbers, emissions per person times number of people, you get total emissions. So the size of those blocks that you look at, each one of those blocks is a country or a region. The size of those blocks signifies the emissions that are coming out of that particular geography. And you see on the left there, you have the United States. Not that many people. It's a big country, but not that many people, but they have huge carbon footprints per capita. So you have a sort of a narrow high bar of US emissions, which gives you the number 2 emitters in the world. You have other countries to the right of this chart. You have India there, you have Africa, large population groups, but people who don't emit a lot of carbon at all. Very, very low carbon footprints, but you multiply very little times lots of people and you still get a lot of emissions. So India is a top 3 emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, but a very different sort of social, even ethical profile of what those emissions are. They're sort of subsistence emissions, if you will, rather than luxury emissions, but still it's a top 3 emitter. And then you have China there in the middle, which does both. Lots of people, relatively high carbon footprint, and that gives you the world's biggest emitter by quite some distance. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of global emissions are now Chinese. You can see, if you have good eyesight, you can see Indonesia. They're roughly in the middle of the chart between the 3 and 4 billion sort of cumulative population mark, that little red block there. Indonesia is a top 10 emitter, as many of you will know. I think it's the 8th biggest emitter in the world if you aggregate Europe into one, European Union into one. The other thing that's noteworthy about Indonesia is that the color code is bright red, and that color coding in the chart signifies that emissions are still going up. The blue colors, US, there, a lot of the European countries, their emissions have peaked. Emissions in emerging markets, including Indonesia, are still going up. And that's kind of the unfairness of climate change. The atmosphere doesn't care where emissions come from. The atmosphere just cares, is it less than 250 billion tons? But where those tons come from has ethical or climate justice implications. And a lot of the emissions growth come from countries that haven't emitted a lot in the past. But even those emissions will have to be curtailed when it comes to net zero. So that's the sort of emissions challenge. That's where emissions come from. How do we reduce them? Let me give you a very simple equation. It's usually said that you lose half the audience for every equation that you put up. So I'm only putting up one. And it's a very simple one, actually. It's in fact, it's an identity. It's a tautology. And it's called the Kaya identity after the Japanese economist who wrote it down first. And what you see here is carbon emissions that come from the energy sector. Energy is about, or energy-related emissions are about 80% of the story. I think they're a bit less than that in Indonesia, but globally, energy emissions are about 80% of the emission story. And those energy-related emissions, that carbon is the product of three factors. Carbon divided by energy, that's the carbon intensity of energy, times energy per GDP, that's the energy intensity of the economy, times GDP. And you see it's an identity because that relationship holds by definition. You can sort of energy cancels out, GDP cancels out, you have carbon equals carbon. So this is true by definition. And that means if you want to reduce carbon, the expression on the left, you have three ways, exactly three ways, and only three ways in which you can do that. You can either reduce the carbon intensity of energy, the first coefficient there. That's the story of renewable energy, the story of clean energy more broadly, hydro, nuclear, biomass, wind, solar. So changing the energy or the fuel mix in the energy sector. The second factor is the energy intensity of GDP. That's the story of efficiency, energy efficient appliances, energy efficient processes, or more broadly, resource efficient processes. But it's also a story of structural change in an economy, moving out of carbon intensive growth into carbon light growth, the move into a weightless economy, as Danny Kuo has termed it. And then it's a story of behavior change, just how we heat our homes, or how much we drive and how much we fly. And only once you've exhausted those two factors, only then you sort of turn to the third factor, which is GDP. If you can't reduce the carbon intensity and the energy intensity, then you have to sort of reduce GDP. But that's sort of a last resort. And the argument I would like to make is that the first two factors actually get us a very long way in reducing emissions. Here's the evidence for that claim. It is 20 plus countries in the world that have decoupled carbon from GDP. So the first and the last factor in the Kaya equation that you've just seen, those two factors have been disconnected. You sort of see GDP going up in places like Singapore, New Zealand, a lot of the European countries, while emissions are coming down. So it's possible actually to decouple CO2 emissions from GDP. It's possible to reduce emissions and maintain economic prosperity. How does one do that? I quickly give you the example of the UK. How has the UK decoupled CO2 from GDP? In the UK, where I'm based, we are proud to sort of have reduced our emissions by about 50% since 1990, while GDP is up by about 80%. If you do the math, that means that the UK is using 3 times less carbon per unit of GDP than we did in 1990. So 3 times increase in efficiency. How have we done that? The chart you're looking at here is how emissions have changed over the last couple of years since the 2010s. And you see that most of that emission reduction has come from just one sector, from power generation, electricity generation, where emissions have come down very, very sharply indeed. While in most other sectors, emissions have flatlined or probably even gone up. This is sort of a 2018-19 chart where transport emissions were still going up slightly, building emissions were flatlining. So it was really a story of just electricity generation, which had been decarbonized. How had electricity generation been decarbonized? And that's a story of getting out of coal. The chart you look at here is the fuel mix in the UK, and you see the grey bit, the share of coal in power generation used to be pretty much 100% up until about the 1960s, when nuclear came in And then eventually in the 1980s or so, there was market liberalization, the dash for gas. Gas came in. And then in about the 2010s or so, renewable energy, in particular offshore wind, started to become prominent, and coal was squeezed. And in fact, this less than a month ago, the UK closed its last remaining coal-fired power station. So we now have a coal-free power sector in the UK. And it's that squeeze of coal out of power generation that has driven our emission reductions. How have we done that? Basically, the UK has thrown everything at the problem that you can think of. There were favorable market trends, the introduction of gas, which was a market driver, which turned out to be cheaper than coal most of the time. There were environmental regulations that had to do with air quality, which curtailed the hours that coal plants could run for air quality reasons. And then there were specific climate policies in the form of carrots and sticks. The stick was a carbon price in the form of emissions trading and a tax, and the carrot was subsidies for the clean alternative for renewables. So everything, literally everything, was thrown at the problem. But the result was coal is out of the power system in the UK, and our emissions are down 50%. So that's sort of an example of just how it can be done, that it can be done, and where you want to start. That's a look into the past, how the UK has performed so far, how other countries have performed so far. Let's look forward. If we want to move from current emission levels to net zero, global net zero by the middle of the century, how do we do that? And it's sort of, in a sense, a race to net zero, a race by different emission sources, so that different runners in the race are running at different speeds, if you will. And the first sector to decarbonize is electric power, just as the UK has done. The sort of rational strategy, those emission reduction plans that now proliferate, there are lots of them. They all start with decarbonizing electricity. Why do we start with decarbonizing electricity? Two reasons. One is the technologies are there, renewables are there, they're cheap, they're increasingly cheaper than fossil fuels. There's path dependence, rigidities, and all that. But if you hard-nosed look at the economics, suggest renewables are the source, generating source of choice. So that's the first reason. The technology is there and it's cheap. The second reason is once you've decarbonized the power sector, you can then use clean electricity to decarbonize some of the other sectors, some of the other runners in the net zero race. And the second runner in the race is surface transport. And that's exactly a sort of a case in point to what I just said. The way to decarbonize surface transport is through electrification. It's through electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are now, they're not quite the point where renewables are, where they're sort of the default option if you want a new car, but they're increasingly getting there. The automotive industry has bought into electric vehicles. There's sort of an arms race going on, an industrial arms race going on as to who will build the cheapest, best electric cars with the longest range. So within 10 years or so, I think electric vehicles will be the default. They will be cheaper, equally efficient or same range, same quality of driving, cheaper to run. So that's within 10 years, that will be the case. So the second runner in the race, surface transport, we use clean electricity to decarbonize. The third runner in the race is buildings. We have to either cool buildings or heat buildings and sort of reduce the carbon footprint of buildings. Again, here you can use clean electricity to do that. If it's a matter of cooling, clean electricity can help with air conditioning. If it's a matter of heating, where I come from, heating is the thing to do. And that is then a story of switching from gas-fired building heating to electric heating through heat pumps. Heat pumps work. They work in cold climates like in Scandinavia or in Switzerland, where I'm originally from. So it's just a matter of sort of rolling out that technology. That technology isn't anywhere near where renewables are or where electric vehicles are, but it's there, it's existing. And so we just have to sort of find ways of increasing public acceptability and finding ways also of reducing the cost of these things. The next runner in the race is industry. You see it's getting increasingly more challenging to reduce those particular sectors. Industry, particularly electro-intensive industry, carbon-intensive industries like steel, like petrochemicals, like cement. Electrification is part of the story here as well in two ways. In steel, for example, you can move from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, which sort of uses electricity and scrap metal to produce steel. And that's an electrification story. But then there are also in lots of sectors the replacement fuel for coal or fossil fuels will be hydrogen. And hydrogen is very electro-intensive to produce, at least if you want to produce it in a clean way through electrolysis. And again, you can use clean electricity to produce hydrogen, which then in turn can help us reduce industrial emissions. The next runner in the race, and it's again getting more complicated, is non-energy related emissions, agriculture and land use emissions, which are about 20% of the global story, a bit more in Indonesia, I believe. For agriculture, we don't have a technology fix. We don't have a sort of an electric car equivalent or a heat pump equivalent. So it tends to be a story of behavior change. It tends to be a story of different diets. Move out of meat-based diets into plant-based diets, which would massively reduce the carbon footprint of the agriculture sector. Then efficiency gains, less food waste and so on, different farming practices, that can get us some way when it comes to agriculture. But these things are difficult. Changing people's eating habits is a behavioral sort of struggle that's on a different order of magnitude than just changing technology. And of course, land use, the other part of land use is deforestation, which on paper is very easy and very cheap to do. You have a lot of biodiversity, nature benefits if you protect your forests, but the political economy of doing that, as you know very well from your own country, is an altogether different story indeed. So the agriculture land use story is more a political economy story, a behavior story. It's not a technology story. And then the final runner in the race, I would argue aviation is overtaking land use gently, but the final runner in the race is aviation, flying around, where again, the technological fixes are only just emerging. We probably don't have them yet, the sort of synthetic fuels and so on. So again, the story will be one of behavior change, will be of flying less, constraining demand. Using Zoom, I'm talking to you from my office in Oxford. I didn't fly all the way to Indonesia to talk to you, saving a little bit of carbon in the process. So that is how we can decarbonize an economy. I hope I made it sound feasible. I hope I made it sound as if we have a plan, because we do have a plan. There are lots of models that tell you how one decarbonizes an economy. It's a matter of political will. It's a matter of leadership. It's a matter of mobilizing the right finance. It's not a matter of, we need to find some miracle solution or some miracle technology. We know exactly what the technologies are. We know exactly what the solutions are. We just have to find a political, social, economically acceptable way of implementing them. Which brings me to the final third of my presentation, the socioeconomic risks and opportunities that come out of that decarbonization path that I just described. What are sort of the pitfalls, but also the opportunities that come out of this decarbonization path that gets us to net zero by the middle of the century? Let me start with the social challenges. And a big social challenge is what happens to consumers, what happens to households. This is a picture of a French protest against the carbon tax the Yellow Vest protest, that's probably about 10 years ago by now, and households who felt already under pressure for cost of living increases felt that sort of making energy even more expensive through carbon taxation and a switch to renewables, that was one bridge too far. Now, two counter arguments to that. One is that, as I said a minute ago, renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels in most contexts. So the story that energy bills will go up, that's a temporary story at best, and it's probably a story of badly designed electricity sectors that don't pass on the efficiency gains from renewables to consumers. So that's the first observation I would make. The second observation I would make is that the distributional incidence of who bears the cost of the transition, that's a political choice. I'll give you the UK example again. In the UK, we have decided, rightly or wrongly in my opinion, that the cost of renewable energy, which used to be expensive in the beginning, it's now cheaper than fossil fuels, but those legacy costs are there. And those legacy costs are borne by by bill payers. It's those costs are covered through electricity bills. They could have been covered through tax rates. They could have been covered through taxation. Taxation is progressive, so it would have been a fair outcome. Energy bills are regressive, so it's an unfair outcome. Energy bills, poor people pay a larger share of their income on electricity bill than rich people. So the outcome is unfair, is distributionally unfair. But that was a political choice. That was the government decided to want to do it that way. That isn't sort of inbuilt or God-given. This is a choice. A second social challenge that we often hear about, and it's a real one and an important one, is what happens to workers in high carbon sectors? What happens to coal miners, to steel workers, to people in petrochemicals? And that is something we do need to take seriously. That it's called just transition in the sort of the climate change jargon, the sort of the fairness to the workforce in those high carbon sectors. A couple of things to say to that. One is, it is true that we have very few, hardly any examples of successful structural change that has been equitable and fair. It's always been deeply painful and deeply disruptive to the communities involved. The way the UK got out of coal in the 1990s, 80s, 90s under Margaret Thatcher left deep scars that left very, very sort of suffering communities who still feel the sort of the aftermaths of that structural change. So we don't have practical examples of how one does that. But we do have theoretical examples. We have one or two practical good examples of how one does it. And it's a story of collaboration. It's a story of planning. It's a story of bringing everybody together. You bring economic planners together. You bring the trade unions together. You bring industry together. You come up with a clear vision, a clear plan. You have to finance that plan. You have to sort of find retraining schemes. You have to find pension contributions for people you retire early. So there's a lot of effort that has to go into it, but through collaboration, it can be done. The other final thing I want to say about the just transition and workers is it's too much of a discussion about number of jobs, the story of jobs disappearing, whereas it should be a story of changing skills. There's no evidence that the zero carbon economy has fewer jobs than the high carbon economy. There's evidence that it has different jobs. It requires different skills. Typically, it requires more cognitive problem-solving skills, so it needs better educated workers that have those problem-solving and cognitive skills, and fewer sort of pure manual skills. So that then becomes a challenge of reskilling, of education, of training. A lot of that training, incidentally, can be done on the job. The skill gap is relatively small. So if you're an architect, you continue to be an architect, you just have to learn the art of building zero carbon homes. If you're working in the financial sector, rather than giving loans to to steel companies and power coal-fired power stations, you have to give loans to wind farms, and you have to sort of learn how those profiles look. But you're still, you're still a banker, you're still an architect. So that's the story of social challenges as relates to workers. Let's look at some of the ecological challenges. Climate change is a big problem, absolutely, but it's not the only environmental problem we face. The nature crisis is probably on a par to the climate crisis, and we have to make sure that solving one problem doesn't make the other one worse. And there are risks that this might happen in the sort of land use sector that many of you will be familiar with. There's a risk that sort of overzealous reforestation with the view of maximizing the carbon sequestration of an ecosystem can be detrimental to biodiversity as a whole. So, homogeneous plantations of fast-growing, often exotic trees, they can be detrimental to the ecosystems, the natural biodiversity of a country. So you have to do these things with both nature and climate in mind. Another worry we often hear is the growing demand for minerals, for critical minerals. A battery has a lot of lithium and cobalt and other critical minerals in it, which the demand for which is growing. So we have to be able to source those materials in an environmentally sustainable way. And it's absolutely true. We don't do that yet. We don't have an environmentally sustainable way for many of those minerals just yet. So we have to work on that. The other thing we have to work on is sort of curtail the demand for those minerals through circular economy strategies, through recycling strategies, and through resource efficiency strategies. And there's some evidence emerging. There's a very powerful paper from the US, from the Rocky Mountain Institute, that sort of says that we might reach peak minerals or peak minerals for cars as early as the mid-2030s, maybe 2040, because from then on, we have sort of dug out all that we need, and through recycling, through circular strategies, we can continue to sort of build the cars and the batteries that we need from then on. That's quite bullish, but you can sort of see the power of recycling, the power of circular economy argument in addressing some of those planetary boundaries. Economic challenges. I give you two economic challenges, and then the final thing I will tell you is an economic opportunity. So we're almost there. Stranded assets is often seen as a risk for investors, for the economy. Stranded asset means you sit on a fossil fuel asset, on a coal-fired power station, and you figure out that you have to write off that asset before it's sort of the end of its economic life, because environmentally you're not able to run it anymore. That's absolutely real. And I give you two examples. An upstream example. If you look at all the fossil fuel reserves that we have, the coal, the oil, the gas that is listed on the balance sheets of fossil fuel companies, and you compare it to the 250 gigatons of carbon space that I talked about in the beginning, you figure out we have about multiple times, I think it's 3 or 4 times the amount of carbon in fossil fuel reserves compared to what we are allowed to put in the atmosphere. The flip side is that 2/3 of that stuff on the balance sheets of those companies cannot be burned, has to remain underground. So that gives you a stranded assets, because 2/3 of the asset is unburnable. Now, the good news about that is we know. I just told you, and it's not a secret. The whole investor community knows, and you can start planning for these things, and you can make investment decisions accordingly. The second example I want to give you is downstream. If you look at all the power stations in the world, all the coal-fired power stations, the gas-fired power stations, and you ask, how long do they still have to run? And how do they run? What's their regime? Are they base load? Are they peak load? And you calculate the sort of the committed emissions that come out of those power stations and the economic life they have left. And you figure out the sort of the share of the power sector in the 250 gigatons is pretty much used up by everything That's already built. So anything you build from now on, as an investor, you have to be, you face the probability that you will not be able to run that asset in the way you had planned. Again, I just told you, and I haven't told you a secret. So investors can make those decisions, and they can make rational decisions. They can figure out what assets they want to invest in and what assets they want to bypass. So standard assets is a real problem, but it's increasingly a problem that can be tackled by informed, knowledgeable investors that presumably know how to take risks and manage risks. Another economic risk that often comes up has to do with competitiveness effects. The big worry in the European Union in particular, the worry that if my carbon policies are more stringent than your carbon policies, then industries will move to the more lenient regulatory regimes, and the jobs and the carbon emissions and the economic prosperity moves to other constituencies from Europe to China or whatever. Now, the counter-argument to that is twofold. First of all, is if you look at the data up to now, there's absolutely no evidence of carbon leakage or competitiveness effects. There's a lot of evidence of high carbon activities moving to Asia, but that has all to do with globalization. That has nothing or very little to do with climate policies. That's the first argument. So the empirics today sort of suggest this isn't a big problem. The second argument is the problem of the future may not be big either. And the reason for saying that is that every country in the world, including the ones that Europe competes with, Indonesia, China, Southeast Asia, they all have their own carbon reduction plans. So the carbon costs of all companies or of all countries in the world, they're starting to level. They're starting to become equal. So the disparity, that wedge between what we are doing and what everybody else is doing, that's starting to go away. So that was the risks. Let me stop on an optimistic note and tell you a story of how the net zero transition can also be a story of economic opportunity and growth. I'm talking to Ministry of Finance people and their stakeholders, so let me use the name of three prominent economists to tell that story. There's a Keynesian story. John Maynard Keynes gave us the idea of how one kickstarts an ailing economy through demand-side stimulus investment. And we need a lot of investment for the green economy. It's a very capital-intensive transition. And that investment that can give the economy, if it's an ailing economy, can give it a sort of a Keynesian boost. It can stimulate an economy through a demand side boost, for example, following the pandemic or following an economic crisis. The second growth story is via Arthur Pigou, the man who gave us the notion of externalities and market imperfections. And addressing climate change doesn't just sort of address the climate externality, it can also address a lot of other market imperfections. Better health standards mean more productive workers, for example. There will be less of a sort of a monopoly in the electricity sector because renewable energy companies have much more competitive features than the sort of the incumbent operators where you have economies of scale. So we can have more efficient, more powerful, more competitive economies as a result of the low carbon transition. And finally, and probably most powerfully, is the story of Joseph Schumpeter, the man who gave us creative destruction. The idea that the nimble, innovative newcomers can shake up a sector, can change the composition of a sector, lead to market exit and replacement by more nimble, innovative firms that then create innovation, investment, and growth. That's the story of the iPhone and IT, where we have seen that in action big time. But it can also be the story of electric vehicles, for example. It can be the story of renewable energy. We see it in the car industry very big time, where the incumbent operators have to fight against the newcomers from China, the newcomers, Tesla, and so on. And we see creative destruction at work. We see it in some emerging markets with the renewable energy entrepreneurs that are challenging the incumbent entrepreneurs as well. So creative destruction, Schumpeterian economics, is a feature that we might see as part of the net zero transition, and it's a feature that will give us a lot of potential economic growth. Let me stop here because we want to have a little bit of time for questions. So let me also stop sharing. I can see you again and look forward to your comments, your questions, your suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I believe this seminar will engage many people who are interested with the climate change issue. It can be seen by the about 260 participants from Zoom, and then about 700 from YouTube. I believe your presentation will give us insight substances regarding to the climate change. From your presentation, if I may, to conclude that you mentioned about what countries that are involved to commit the Paris Agreement, and then what sector that should be focused on, and then what is the social impact, social challenges, and then the economic opportunities, the social economic opportunities. I have one question for you, Professor. Do you have any idea or a suggestion that how Indonesia should implement the transition from the fuel for fossil fuels usage into the renewable? As you know, Indonesia should have a right to have a good and positive growth. And then, as you know, if we want to have a positive growth, I believe there is a possibility to have a trade-off with the social environment and climate change. Do you have any idea what Indonesia should do to address this kind of challenges, opportunities, and so on, Professor? Please.
Okay, not a straightforward question, and obviously you know Indonesia a lot better than I do. But let me sort of give you a few pointers that sort of come from other countries that might be applicable to Indonesia. And one problem that you face, I know I had an Indonesian student, is that you have a lot of power purchase agreements. So you have a lot of contractual obligations that lock in coal for 10, 20, 30 years. So you will have to find a solution for those long-term contracts because you don't have 20, 30 years of coal burning left. We don't have that space. So what does one do? You can either break the contract. That's pretty bad for your investment climate, and the market will punish you. They will sort of figure out that this isn't a credible party, and they will price things accordingly. Or you can negotiate your way out of. You can just buy out the remaining contract. That's costly, so you probably want to go back to your IF funds and the people who pay into the fund and see whether you can pay out the contract. So that's one thing you can do. You also want to sort of start destroying demand on the other side by promoting the clean alternative. So it's sort of a balance act of phasing down dirty and phasing up clean. And renewable energy in an Indonesian context, I'm pretty sure, is cheaper than fossil fuels. And so that's a matter of nurturing that sector, of promoting that sector. Give them the same, contractual certainty, perhaps through auctions, as the fossil fuel industry has. You have the same issue there as well, of course. You will lock yourself into a long-term contract, and renewable energy is developing so fast that the contracts you sign today will be relatively expensive compared to the ones you sign in 5-10 years. So you probably want to put in breakout clauses and things like that into your contracts. But yeah, just go aggressive. All growth can be renewable from now on. Find a solution to buy yourself or negotiate yourself out of the existing contracts. That might be the starting point.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I agree with you. We have to solve about the supply and demand, right? Thank you for your explanation. And we have someone who has raised her hand. I would like to call upon Miss Arimbi. Please shortly introduce yourself, tell us your name and your office, and then ask your question. Please, Arimbi.
Okay, thank you, Bapak Irwan, for the opportunity. Good afternoon in Indonesia time, Mr. Van Hauser. Let me introduce myself. My name is Arimbi from Financial Education and Training Agency, Ministry of Finance. I would like to ask a simple question following your explanation about Paris Agreement. So how crucial is international collaboration in overcoming challenges that countries might face in meeting the carbon budget goals? And what forms could this cooperation take? Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Arimbi. Good question. Yeah, it's sort of, in about a month's time, there will be the annual climate summit, the conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it's COP29. So we've been at it for almost 30 years. And you can sort of ask, what have 30 years of blood, sweat, and tears and negotiations, what has that achieved? The answer is it hasn't achieved nearly as much as it should have, but a bit like democracy, it's the least best, the least bad form of going about things. It has sort of, it has focused the mind. The Paris Agreement has focused the mind. There's a balancing act of countries going into Paris, sort of knowing that they can do it and then committing to more than they thought they could do. So that sort of dynamic is very important, actually. But we're starting to see sort of the dynamics sort of going beyond the international agreements. We're starting the private sector sort of running ahead of the policymakers, and that's very important. So renewable energy is a good example. We can now sort of assume that the renewable transition will just happen. The market dynamics are so strong that the negotiations will come up with targets, which are big targets, good targets, like tripling capacity by 2030. They set the mood music, but industry is already behind it. Industry is already going to do that. Electric vehicles, arguably a similar thing. The industry is behind it. The worry we now have is that we're starting trade wars over electric vehicles, and in Europe we might sort of have tariffs on Chinese imports. That then needs international negotiations to level the playing field again. But that's then not necessarily the UNFCCC, that's then the WTO. So the international negotiations broadens beyond the environmental field into other fields of collaboration.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Van Heuser, for the answers.
Is it clear, Ms. Arimbi?
Yes, Crystal.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much. And then next question we have from another platform from Slido. Please mute it. Please the admin to mute the voices. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, Professor. We have another question from Hisma Yuliat Abu Sofyan. The question is, how can we transition to environmentally friendly energy sources without harming vital sectors and low-income communities reliant on fossil fuels? Please.
Yeah, very good question. And it's the story of the just transition that I briefly mentioned in passing when I spoke. We have to sort of be proactive about the sort of the fossil fuel communities, and we have to be proactive about low-income communities. For me, the low-income community answer is a lot easier to give. If you sort of think of the sort of the electrification challenge, it's probably not Indonesia's challenge, but in other parts in South Asia and Africa, there's still a lot of people who don't have modern electricity. And renewable energy is actually the best opportunity we have, the best solution we have to bring modular, clean, affordable electricity to those communities. I imagine there are remote communities in Indonesia as well where the grid isn't a credible option, whereas mini grids or renewable energy solutions will be. So renewables is actually, I would say, pro-poor. It's certainly pro-electrification. It's a way in which you can reach communities and then scale up. Demand is growing. You have modular solutions and you scale up. The sort of what happens to the vital sectors is that's a more difficult question. I said before that it's a matter of skills and transferring skills and learning new skills, and that's true. It's also a question of labor market mobility. The new jobs and the old jobs, they differ in the skill mix. They may also differ in their location. So you have to develop labor markets and support policies in labor markets that increase that flexibility of the market, that makes it easier to learn new skills, but that also makes it easier for jobs to move around. Either the workers move to the jobs or the jobs move to the workers. You have to build in that sort of economic flexibility and that economic nimbleness. And that's a question of policies, education policies, skill training policies. As I said before, the green jobs, they have high cognitive skill demands, they have high problem-solving demands. So those are good jobs. That's jobs that, if you have those skills, you earn a comfortable living and a comfortable salary.
Okay, thank you, Professor. It is clear about what you have explained to us, and then we have from the Zoom participant, we have Mr. Aditya Rahmat who has raised his hand. Please tell your name and from your office, and then ask your question. Please. You still muted.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm
Yes.
sorry if you hear some noises because there's another event going on in my office right now. Thank you, Professor Sam, for your insightful presentation about our discussion today. So, following up your last topic regarding the economic opportunities of climate action, I just want to pick one or two questions about this matter. Many people say that Indonesia has a very big opportunity regarding the economic terms while navigating the climate action or mitigating the climate change uh, because of the growing carbon trade mechanism. But on the other hand, many people are worried that this mechanism actually opens up a legal way for industries to greenwash their businesses, which means maintaining the status quo. And at the end of the day, the ultimate goal to reduce the emissions won't be achieved. So I wonder how do you see about these two different opinions about the carbon trade mechanism, and what do you think? What should regulators or government should pay attention in facing these challenges? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. There's a very good question, a very important question, and you're absolutely right. One of the reasons why net zero has a bad name in some quarters is because of that risk that the targets are being achieved through greenwashing measures rather than genuinely being achieved. What I would say to that, first of all, is the following. Global net zero isn't negotiable. If you want to stabilize temperature, you do need, that balance of emissions into the atmosphere and out of the atmosphere. There's no other way. How you translate that global imperative into targets for different companies, that's a different matter. And there we do need those integrity standards. We do need to make sure we don't have greenwashing. But the concept is net zero, so inbuilt in it is an element of offsetting. So it's not gross zero. There will be sectors that are gross zero. They don't need any offsets, power sector probably. But some sectors will need the offset. So how does one introduce integrity into those? We've written a paper a couple of years back called the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting, grand title for a piece of common sense, really. And what those principles say is the following. First of all, offsetting is a last resort, so companies should reduce their emissions first, and they can usually reduce them more than they think. If you have to do offsetting, the second thing you want to do is you want to have a preference over emission of carbon removal over emission avoidance projects. So carbon removal projects are things like tree planting or carbon capture and storage, versus emission avoidance, which are things like, cook stoves and energy efficiency and so on. The reason for saying that is that the carbon avoidance doesn't give you net zero, because my residual emissions and your avoided emissions is a positive total of emissions. Whereas if you have carbon removals, then my positive emissions and your negative emissions does give us net zero. So if you do offsets, there's a premium for carbon removal over emission avoidance. Within carbon removal, that's the third principle. You have to do like for like offsetting. So if the emissions you're offsetting is from fossil fuels, so carbon that was on the ground, put the carbon back on the ground and use geological removal techniques. If the emissions you're removing are biological from agriculture, then biological storage is a good thing, because the carbon goes back to where it came from, as it were. If you sort of don't do that, if you sort of offset geological or fossil fuel emissions through tree planting, for example, you essentially move carbon from the Earth's crust into the biosphere. So you turn rocks into trees, and there will be a limit to that activity. It's a good transition activity. It has biodiversity benefits, but ultimately you do need that like for like offsetting.
Is it clear, Mas Adit? Okay. Thank you, Sam, for your briefly explanation. We have here in Zoom audience and participants from our subnational government. There is one last question from Alfian Amar from the city of Bau Bau from Southeast Sulawesi. His question is, as you know, in Indonesia, many subnational government are depend on the fossil fuels for their economic activities. So the question is, how can we balancing the needs for the economic activities by using the fossil fuels with the commitment from commitment to achieve the net zero? Please, Professor.
Yeah, good question. Let me start by saying that subnational entities are hugely important in the sort of transition to net zero, because a lot of the decisions that impact emissions and impact emission reductions, they are taken at the subnational level. They're taken by regional governments. They're taken by municipal administrations. Municipal transport, for example, is a big source of emissions and a big opportunity to reduce emissions. Planning is often a regional or local responsibility, and planning decisions have a huge impact on emissions profiles. First, by facilitating clean investments, and then also by imposing condition on dirty investment. So place-based activities, local climate action is hugely important, very, very important indeed. I think cities face similar sort of challenges in having to trade off the sort of the benefits of their actions and the potential costs of their actions. They will rely on national governments to deal with some of the the sort of the costlier aspects. The things we talked about reskilling, about sort of labor market flexibility, those tend to be national prerogatives. So the city administrations will have to rely on the national government to put those measures in place, and they can lobby for them, they can ask for them. But then there's certain things that as I said, they can do on their own turf, and they might have local benefits. In the UK, we have sort of part of the story we have from net zero is a story of industrial regeneration. It's a story of bringing new jobs to areas where sort of deindustrialization has caused a lot of economic hardship, but where the introduction of green jobs in economic clusters, in sort of green clusters, can sort of create new jobs and new hubs of economic activity, green economic activity. So hydrogen production, for example, carbon capture and storage, renewable energy generation, bringing that offshore wind onshore. Those can be sort of sources of economic renewal, as it were, for areas that need that sort of economic boost. So those are some of the probably doesn't answer your question fully, but hopefully it gives you some cause for optimism.
Okay, thank you, Professor. If I may conclude that we have the subnational government should have knowledge and awareness about the climate change issue and environmental issue, and then good planning is important. And last one, I think we have to change our behavior to be more environmentally side. Okay, thank you, Professor. And then, all right, Sam, is there any few last messages that you would like to address to our audience?
No substantive comments. I talked a lot, but only to thank you for joining this afternoon, my morning, your afternoon, for a good discussion, and wish you luck in your activities. Hopefully, a fair few of you will be actively involved in the net zero transition, and I hope you'll be successful in that.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor, and for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to Sam. Thank you, Sam. See you next time. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that this is the end of our today's session with Sam. It will be useful to bear in mind that achieving net zero is both technically and economically feasible, but not all sectors or emission sources are equally prepared for the transition. It is essentially for countries to collaborate and align their efforts to meet the carbon budget goals set by the Paris Agreement. Again, thank you for being with us today. I would like to give the screen back to our Master of Ceremony, Pradina Anis. Back to you, Anis. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Sam Venkhauser, for your insightful presentation today. And I would also like to thank Bapak Irwan Darmawan for moderating today's session. It was much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a fruitful discussion today. And now, we come to the end of the Ministry of Finance Learning Week Day 4. As I mentioned on the opening, today is the last day of Ministry of Finance Learning Week this year. However, we are pleased to inform that our next agenda of Ministry of Finance Learning Festival is National Symposium of Public Finance to be held on next week on October 15th, 2024. Please save the date and don't forget to join. To all participants who join us today, we would like to extend our deepest appreciations for your support and participation. Please fill in the evaluation form by scanning the QR code on the screen or click the link in the chat box to give feedback. You can claim your certificate after finish filling in the evaluation form. Okay, that's all. Stay healthy, everyone. See you on Ministry of Finance Learning Week next year. I'm Pradina Anis. Have a good day. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.